Flight 847 from Denver to Miami was supposed to be just another routine Tuesday morning departure. The passengers settled into their seats with coffee and newspapers, laptops and headphones, completely unaware that in exactly 47 minutes, their ordinary flight would become a life-or-death situation that would test the limits of human courage. And in seat 14A sat a woman whose quiet demeanor and simple black sweater concealed a secret that would ultimately save every single life on board. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rachel Martinez adjusted her carry-on bag under the seat in front of her and pulled out a worn paperback novel. The early morning flight from Denver International Airport was only half full, which meant she'd have the luxury of an empty middle seat beside her. After 3 weeks of intense combat training exercises in Colorado, she was looking forward to finally getting home to her small apartment in Fort Lauderdale. The 28-year-old Army intelligence specialist had deliberately chosen civilian clothes for her journey home. Her military uniform was neatly folded in her checked luggage, along with her service ribbons and combat boots. The only indication of her military background was the dog tags tucked beneath her sweater and the military ID card in her wallet, items she'd grown so accustomed to carrying that she barely noticed them anymore. Flight attendant Jennifer Walsh moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, checking overhead compartments and ensuring seatbelts were properly fastened. The Boeing 737 carried 132 passengers that morning, a typical mix of business travelers, vacationers, and locals heading home. In Seat 8C, businessman David Thompson was already working on his laptop, preparing for a crucial presentation in Miami. 3 rows behind him, elderly couple Margaret and Harold Peterson were sharing a crossword puzzle, celebrating their 45th wedding anniversary with a cruise departure later that evening. Captain James Sullivan completed his final pre-flight checks in the cockpit. With over 20 years of commercial flying experience, he'd logged more than 15,000 flight hours without a single major incident. His co-pilot, Mark Chun, was reviewing weather reports for their route south. Clear skies and minimal turbulence were predicted for the entire 2.5-hour journey. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate at exactly 7:15 a.m., Rachel opened her book to Chapter 12. She'd been trying to finish this thriller novel for months, stealing moments to read between training exercises and briefings. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was reading about international espionage while returning from her own classified intelligence training. Though her real work was far less glamorous than anything portrayed in fiction, the takeoff was smooth, and within minutes they were climbing through the morning clouds above the Rocky Mountains. Rachel glanced out her window at the peaks below, already missing the crisp mountain air and the intensity of the training program she'd just completed. The 3 weeks had been challenging, even for someone with her background: advanced interrogation techniques, threat assessment protocols, and counterintelligence operations that pushed every trainee to their mental and physical limits. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her younger brother Miguel, who was stationed in Germany with the Air Force. "Safe flight, sis. Can't wait to hear about your super-secret spy training." She smiled and typed back a quick response before switching her phone to airplane mode. Miguel always teased her about the classified nature of her work, but he understood the importance of operational security better than most. 20-5 minutes into the flight, the seatbelt sign had been turned off and passengers were settling into their routines. Rachel had made good progress on her book when she noticed a commotion several rows ahead. A man in seat 4B had stood up abruptly and was reaching into the overhead compartment with unusual urgency. Something about his movements caught her attention. They were too deliberate, too focused, unlike a typical passenger retrieving a forgotten item. She watched as the man, appearing to be in his mid-30s with dark hair and a beard, pulled out what looked like a small black bag. Her training immediately kicked in, and she began scanning the cabin more carefully. In seat 9A, another man was fidgeting nervously, checking his watch repeatedly and looking toward the front of the plane. A third individual in seat 12F kept glancing back toward the rear of the aircraft, as if monitoring something or someone. Rachel's pulse quickened as she recognized the behavioral patterns from her recent counterintelligence training, the synchronization of their movements, the way they avoided making eye contact with other passengers, the subtle positioning that gave them visual coverage of different sections of the cabin. These weren't coincidences. The man with the black bag began walking toward the front of the plane, moving with the same deliberate purpose she'd noticed earlier. As he passed her row, Rachel caught a glimpse of something metallic in his partially open bag. Her stomach dropped as she realized what she was seeing. Flight attendant Jennifer Walsh was serving beverages from her cart in the forward galley when the man approached her. Rachel watched as he said something quietly to Jennifer, whose face immediately went pale. The flight attendant's hands began shaking as she slowly backed away from her cart, her eyes wide with terror. Other passengers were beginning to notice the disturbance. The businessman in seat 8C looked up from his laptop, confused by the sudden tension in the cabin. The elderly couple stopped their crossword puzzle, sensing something was wrong but not yet understanding the gravity of the situation. The man reached into his bag and withdrew a small but unmistakable handgun, holding it low but visible enough that nearby passengers could see what was happening. A woman in seat 6D gasped audibly, and the sound seemed to trigger a wave of awareness throughout the cabin. Children began crying, and several passengers instinctively reached for their cell phones before remembering they were at 35,000 feet. "Ladies and gentlemen," the man announced in a calm but authoritative voice, "please remain seated and keep your hands visible. This aircraft is now under our control." The word "our" confirmed Rachel's worst fears. This wasn't a lone individual having a breakdown. This was a coordinated attack involving multiple perpetrators. Her eyes quickly located the other two men she'd been watching, both of whom had now produced similar weapons and were positioning themselves strategically throughout the cabin. Captain Sullivan's voice came over the intercom, though his usual confident tone was replaced by something more strained. "Folks, we're experiencing a situation that requires everyone to remain calm and follow instructions from the cabin crew." Rachel knew that behind that measured announcement, the cockpit was likely in chaos. The pilots would be following hijacking protocols, possibly attempting to communicate with air traffic control while trying to maintain control of the aircraft. Her mind raced through the various scenarios she'd studied during training. Most hijacking situations ended either in negotiation and surrender, or in tragedy. The lead hijacker moved toward the front of the cabin, his weapon now clearly visible. "To all passengers, we will be changing our destination today," he announced. "As long as everyone cooperates, no one needs to get hurt." Rachel's training had covered hijacking response protocols extensively. The standard advice for civilians was to remain calm, comply with demands, and wait for professional intervention. But as she assessed the situation more carefully, she realized that professional intervention might not be coming quickly enough. The three hijackers had positioned themselves with clear sight lines throughout the cabin and easy access to both the cockpit and emergency exits. They moved with military precision, suggesting extensive planning and possibly combat experience. This wasn't a spontaneous criminal act. It was a well-orchestrated operation with unknown but clearly serious objectives. Her fellow passengers were responding with a mixture of fear, confusion, and attempted compliance. Some were crying quietly, others were trying to comfort their children or spouses, and a few appeared to be in shock. The businessman had closed his laptop and was sitting rigidly upright, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The elderly couple was holding hands, whispering what might have been prayers. Rachel's mind shifted into the analytical mode that had served her well during intelligence training. She began cataloging details that might prove useful: the physical descriptions of the hijackers, their apparent level of training and organization, their weapons and positioning, and most importantly, any potential weaknesses in their setup. The lead hijacker was now speaking quietly with Jennifer Walsh, who was nodding rapidly while tears streamed down her face. Rachel couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see that the flight attendant was being given specific instructions. Within moments, Jennifer was moving toward the cockpit door, presumably to communicate the hijackers' demands to the flight crew. As the reality of their situation settled over the passengers, Rachel found herself facing a decision that went far beyond her training manuals. Her military oath had been to protect and defend, but the protocol she'd learned assumed she'd be operating with backup equipment and clear command authority. Here, she was alone, outnumbered, and surrounded by innocent civilians whose lives now hung in the balance. The aircraft continued its flight path, though Rachel suspected that would change soon once the hijackers established communication with the cockpit. She thought about her brother Miguel's recent messages about the increasing global tensions and the growing threat of extremist activities. The possibility that this incident was connected to larger geopolitical issues made the situation even more dangerous for everyone on board. Her book lay forgotten on her lap as she continued her careful observation of the three men who now controlled their fate. Every detail mattered: their speech patterns, their coordination methods, their apparent comfort level with their weapons. These weren't desperate amateurs. They were professionals executing a plan that had clearly been rehearsed and refined. Question that dominated her thoughts was simple but critical. What were they ultimately planning to do with this aircraft and its passengers? The cockpit door opened with a mechanical click that seemed to echo through the now silent cabin. Captain Sullivan emerged with his hands raised, followed closely by co-pilot Chun. Both men's faces were grim as they surveyed the transformed interior of their aircraft. The lead hijacker gestured with his weapon for them to move toward the front row of passenger seats. "Gentlemen," the hijacker said, his accent barely detectable but suggesting Eastern European origins, "you will continue flying this aircraft according to new coordinates I will provide. Any attempt to deviate or communicate with ground control without permission will result in immediate consequences for your passengers." Rachel watched the exchange while maintaining her cover as just another terrified passenger. Her intelligence training had included extensive study of hijacking tactics and terrorist methodologies. The professional demeanor of these men, combined with their strategic positioning and apparent knowledge of aircraft operations, suggested this was far from a random act of desperation. The second hijacker, positioned near the middle of the cabin, began addressing the passengers directly. "You will surrender all electronic devices immediately. Phones, tablets, smartwatches, everything goes into these bags." He produced several canvas sacks and began distributing them to passengers in each row. "Anyone found concealing a device will face severe punishment." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Passengers began reluctantly placing their belongings into the bags. Rachel hesitated momentarily, knowing her phone contained encrypted military communications apps that could potentially be useful. But revealing any special capabilities at this stage would only expose her identity prematurely. She dropped her civilian smartphone into the bag when it reached her row. The third hijacker had taken position near the rear emergency exits, effectively blocking any escape route while maintaining visual contact with his associates. Rachel noted their communication system, subtle hand signals, and brief eye contact that indicated extensive coordination training. These weren't amateur criminals. They were operating with military-level precision. Margaret Peterson, the elderly woman celebrating Her anniversary whispered something to her husband Harald. The middle hijacker immediately snapped his attention to them. Silence, no talking unless directly addressed. His harsh tone caused several children to begin crying again, which only increased the tension throughout the cabin. Jennifer Walsh, the flight attendant, was now serving as a messenger between the hijackers and cockpit crew. Rachel could see the woman's hands trembling as she carried folded papers back and forth. The lead hijacker was clearly communicating specific flight, path changes, and possibly other demands to the pilots. Through her window, Rachel noticed the aircraft had begun a gradual turn to the northeast. Instead of continuing toward Miami, they were now heading in a direction that could take them towards several major population centers. Her mind raced through the possibilities: Washington, D.C., New York City, or potentially even international destinations if they planned to refuel somewhere. The businessman, David Thompson, made the mistake of trying to discreetly check his watch. The rear hijacker noticed immediately and moved swiftly down the aisle. "I said no movement without permission." He struck Thompson across the face with the butt of his weapon, causing the man to cry out in pain and shocking the surrounding passengers into even deeper fear. Began trickling from Thompson's nose as he held his hands to his face. His laptop bag, which had been at his feet, was roughly searched by the hijacker, who removed and destroyed several items, including what appeared to be a satellite communication device. Rachel filed this detail away. They were clearly concerned about any technology that might enable outside communication. "Let this be a lesson," the lead hijacker announced to the entire cabin. "Complete obedience is required. Any resistance, any attempt to be clever, will result in pain for you and those around you." Rachel's military training kicked into high gear as she began formulating tactical assessments. The three men were armed with what appeared to be ceramic composite weapons, sophisticated enough to pass through most security screening, but effective enough to control an aircraft full of civilians. Their positioning created overlapping fields of fire that would make any direct assault extremely difficult without multiple casualties. However, she also began identifying potential advantages. The hijackers were focused primarily on controlling the passenger compartment and cockpit, but they hadn't conducted thorough individual searches. Her military ID and dog tags remained concealed, and more importantly, they hadn't discovered the small tactical knife she kept in her boot, a habit maintained from her deployment days. The aircraft continued its northeastern trajectory for another 20 minutes before the lead hijacker made another announcement. "We will be landing at a designated airfield where our demands will be communicated to your government. During this process, you will remain exactly where you are. Any attempt to leave your seat, communicate with others, or cause disruption will result in immediate selection for execution." The word execution sent a chill through the cabin. Several passengers began sobbing openly, while others sat in stunned silence. Rachel maintained her frightened civilian facade while internally calculating options and timelines. If they were planning to land and make demands, it suggested this was a political operation rather than a suicide mission, which potentially offered more opportunities for intervention. Captain Sullivan's voice came over the intercom again, this time with barely concealed stress. "Folks, we're going to be making an unscheduled landing in approximately 40 minutes. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened and follow all instructions from the cabin crew." Rachel knew the captain was following standard protocols while under duress, but she also suspected he and his co-pilot were looking for any opportunity to regain control of their aircraft. The question was whether such an opportunity would present itself before they reached whatever destination the hijackers had in mind. The middle hijacker began moving through the cabin again, this time conducting more thorough visual inspections of passengers. When he reached Rachel's row, she forced herself to display the same mixture of fear and compliance she'd observed in other passengers. Her heart rate increased as he scrutinized her appearance, but her civilian clothes and terrified expression seemed to satisfy his assessment. "You," he said, pointing to a young man in his 20s sitting across the aisle from Rachel. "What is your profession?" "I'm a college student," the young man stammered. "Engineering major at University of Miami." The hijacker studied him for several more seconds before moving on. Rachel realized they were conducting some form of passenger screening, possibly looking for individuals with specific skills or backgrounds that might pose a threat to their operation. Her military intelligence training had covered techniques for avoiding detection in exactly these types of situations. Meanwhile, the lead hijacker was engaged in intense, quiet conversation with Jennifer Walsh near the front of the cabin. Rachel couldn't hear the details, but the flight attendant's increasingly pale complexion suggested she was receiving instructions she found deeply disturbing. When their conversation concluded, Jennifer moved toward the intercom system. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jennifer's voice cracked as she spoke, "I need to inform you that we will be joined by additional personnel when we land. Please prepare yourselves for a potentially extended stay aboard this aircraft." The phrase "additional personnel" sent another wave of fear through the passengers. Rachel's training immediately flagged this as a significant escalation. If more hijackers were joining them at their destination, it suggested a larger operation with multiple phases. The initial aircraft seizure might only be the beginning of a more complex plan. Harold Peterson, the elderly man celebrating his anniversary, began experiencing what appeared to be chest pains. His wife Margaret called out desperately for help, breaking the imposed silence. The rear hijacker moved quickly toward them, weapon raised, but stopped when he saw the man's obvious medical distress. "Please," Margaret pleaded. "He has a heart condition. He needs his medication." The hijacker looked uncertain for the first time since the operation began. He signaled to his leader, who approached to assess the situation. After a brief evaluation, the lead hijacker nodded grimly. "Get his medication, but no sudden movements. Any deception will cost both of your lives." Margaret retrieved a small pill bottle from her purse with shaking hands. As Harold took his medication, Rachel observed the brief moment of human concern that had broken through the hijacker's professional facade. It was a small crack in their operational discipline, but potentially significant if the situation continued to deteriorate. The aircraft began its descent, and through her window, Rachel could see they were approaching what appeared to be a small regional airport rather than a major commercial hub. The choice of landing site suggested careful advance planning, somewhere isolated enough to avoid immediate law enforcement response, but equipped with adequate runway facilities for a Boeing 737. As they descended, the lead hijacker made a final announcement to the passengers. "When we land, you will remain seated until further instructions. Anyone who attempts to leave this aircraft without permission will be shot immediately. Anyone who attempts to communicate our location or situation to outside parties will be shot immediately. Anyone who fails to follow instructions precisely will be shot immediately." The repetitive nature of his threats was clearly intended to reinforce their absolute control over the situation. Rachel recognized the psychological warfare technique from her training, establishing complete dominance through fear while eliminating any thoughts of resistance or escape. The landing was smooth, despite the extraordinary circumstances. As the aircraft taxied toward what appeared to be an isolated hangar facility, Rachel caught glimpses of several vehicles positioned around the area. The level of ground support confirmed her suspicions that this was an extensively planned operation, involving multiple participants. Through the opposite window, she could see armed figures emerging from the vehicles and taking positions around the aircraft. Whatever was about to happen next, it was clear that the initial hijacking had been only the first phase of a much larger and more dangerous plan. The engines wound down, and an ominous silence settled over the cabin as one 132 passengers and crew members waited to learn their fate. The aircraft door opened with a pneumatic hiss, and immediately the cabin temperature dropped as cold air rushed in. Rachel could hear voices outside, sharp, authoritative commands being given in what sounded like multiple languages. The lead hijacker moved to the doorway and began conversing with someone just outside the aircraft. Their exchange was brief but intense, suggesting urgency in whatever plan was now unfolding. Within minutes, 4 additional armed individuals boarded the aircraft. Unlike the original 3 hijackers who had maintained a facade of airline passengers, these new arrivals were dressed in military-style clothing and carried more sophisticated weapons. Rachel's trained eye immediately cataloged the equipment: automatic rifles, tactical gear, and communication devices that suggested coordination with an even larger operation. The new leader, a woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back severely, surveyed the passenger compartment with cold efficiency. When she spoke, her accent was distinctly Russian, and her bearing suggested extensive military or intelligence background. "Status report," she demanded from the original lead hijacker. "Aircraft secured, 132 souls on board. Crew cooperative, no resistance encountered," he responded with military precision. "Passenger screening incomplete. We identified 1 potential engineering student and 1 businessman with satellite communications capability." The woman nodded curtly and began walking slowly down the aisle, examining passengers with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating assets and threats. When she paused at certain seats, Rachel noticed a pattern. She was focusing on individuals who appeared physically capable, professionally dressed, or showed signs of composure under stress. "You," the woman said, stopping at row 7 where a middle-aged man in a navy suit was sitting. "Occupation?" "Federal prosecutor," the man replied quietly, his voice steady despite the circumstances. The woman smiled coldly and made a gesture to one of her associates. "Relocate him to the front row. Special attention required." The prosecutor was roughly escorted forward, joining what was clearly becoming a group of high-value prisoners. 2 rows behind Rachel, a woman in her 30s, wearing scrubs, had been trying to remain invisible. But when the Russian leader reached her row, recognition flickered across her face. "Medical personnel," she announced with satisfaction. "Also front row." As the selection process continued, Rachel realized they were identifying passengers with specific professional skills: legal, medical, technical, and potentially military backgrounds. Her own military training screamed warnings about what this systematic categorization might mean for those selected. The woman paused at Rachel's row, studying her appearance carefully. Rachel maintained her frightened civilian facade, slumping slightly in her seat and avoiding direct eye contact. After several tense seconds, the leader moved on without comment. Rachel's plain clothes and carefully controlled body language had successfully concealed her military background, at least for now. Outside the aircraft, Rachel could hear the sound of heavy machinery. Through her window, she glimpsed what appeared to be fuel trucks and other support vehicles positioning around the plane. The implication was clear: they weren't planning to remain at this location permanently. This was a staging area for something larger. The Russian woman returned to the front of the cabin and addressed the passengers directly. "You are now participants in an operation that will demonstrate the vulnerability of Western transportation systems and the incompetence of your security services. Some of you will play more active roles than others." She gestured toward the group of selected passengers now seated in the front rows. "These individuals have been chosen for their professional capabilities. They will assist us in communicating our demands and ensuring compliance from your government authorities." The federal prosecutor, David Goldman, spoke up despite the obvious risk. "Whatever your political objectives, taking innocent civilians hostage violates international law and will only result in increased law enforcement response." The woman's expression didn't change, but she moved swiftly to stand directly in front of Goldman. "Your legal expertise is precisely why you were selected. Mr. Prosecutor, you understand exactly what laws we are breaking and what penalties we face. That knowledge will help you communicate to your government contacts exactly how serious we are about our demands." She turned back to address the entire cabin. "This aircraft will be departing this location in 30 minutes. Our destination is a major metropolitan area where our true objectives will be revealed. During this time, the selected passengers will be moved to a separate compartment for briefing on their roles." Rachel's stomach tightened as she realized the implications. If they were planning to fly into a populated area with an aircraft full of hostages, the potential for mass casualties extended far beyond the passengers on board. Her military oath to protect innocent life suddenly carried weight that extended to thousands or potentially tens of thousands of people. The medical professional, Dr. Sarah Chun, was escorted toward the front of the aircraft along with 3 other selected passengers. As they passed Rachel's row, Dr. Chun caught her eye briefly. In that instant, Rachel saw not just fear, but also determination, the look of someone preparing to resist despite impossible odds. Meanwhile, ground crews outside were completing their work with military efficiency. Rachel could see armed guards positioned around the perimeter of the landing area, and in the distance, what appeared to be additional aircraft parked in hangars. The scale of the operation was becoming clear. This wasn't an isolated terrorist incident, but part of a coordinated attack involving multiple assets and personnel. The original 3 hijackers had now assumed subordinate roles to the new arrivals, but their positioning remained strategically sound. They maintained control over different sections of the passenger compartment, while the Russian woman and her team focused on the selected high-value individuals, Captain Sullivan and co-pilot Chun were escorted back to the cockpit under heavy guard. Rachel could hear muffled conversations through the cockpit door, presumably involving new flight plans and destinations. The professional tone of the discussions suggested the pilots were being forced to cooperate with complex navigation requirements. One of the new arrivals, a bearded man with distinctive facial scarring, began setting up what appeared to be communication equipment near the front of the cabin. Within minutes, he had established contact with external parties, speaking in rapid Russian while occasionally glancing at the selected passengers. "Washington has been informed of our operation," the Russian woman announced after the communication session concluded. "Federal authorities are now aware that we control this aircraft and its passengers. Their response will determine the ultimate outcome for everyone aboard." Rachel's mind raced through the tactical implications. If federal authorities were now involved, there might be opportunities for outside intervention. But she also knew that hostage rescue operations involving aircraft were extremely complex and carried high casualty risks even under optimal conditions. The woman continued her address. "Your government has exactly 6 hours to meet our demands. If they comply, this aircraft and its passengers will be released at a location of our choosing. If they refuse or attempt any rescue operations, the consequences will be severe for everyone involved." A child in row 9 began crying loudly, causing her mother to attempt to comfort her. The sound seemed to irritate one of the new guards who moved aggressively toward them. But the Russian woman stopped him with a sharp command in their native language. "Children are useful for maintaining emotional pressure," she explained to her subordinate in English, clearly intending for the passengers to understand her calculated approach to psychological warfare. The systematic nature of their operation became even more apparent as they began photographing the selected passengers. Each individual was documented with what appeared to be professional equipment, and their personal identification was carefully recorded. Rachel realized they were creating a catalog of hostages with specific value for negotiation purposes. Dr. Chun was separated from the other selected passengers and taken to the rear of the aircraft with 2 guards. Through the gap between seats, Rachel could see they were forcing the doctor to examine medical supplies from an emergency kit. Implications were ominous. They either expected casualties or were planning to inflict them. The refueling process outside had been completed, and ground crews were now positioning equipment that looked like mobile communication arrays. The hijackers weren't just planning to make demands. They were establishing a command and control center that could coordinate with multiple external assets. Jennifer Walsh, the flight attendant, was brought forward to assist with passenger management. Her face was pale with exhaustion and terror, but she was following instructions precisely. Rachel could see that Jennifer was carefully observing everything around her, possibly gathering information that might prove useful if rescue opportunities arose. The Russian woman checked her watch and spoke to her communication specialist. Initiate Phase 2 protocol. Confirm all secondary assets are in position. She turned back to the passengers with a cold smile. Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to become participants in a demonstration that will be remembered for decades. The aircraft engines began spooling up again, indicating their departure from the staging area was imminent. Through her window, Rachel could see the ground support vehicles pulling away from the aircraft. Whatever their next destination, it was clear they were moving into the most dangerous phase of the operation. As the plane began taxiing toward the runway, Rachel made a critical decision. The time for passive observation was ending. If they were truly heading toward a major population center with hostile intent, her military training and oath demanded action regardless of personal risk. She began mentally preparing for what might be her only opportunity to intervene. The selected passengers were now seated in a tight group under heavy guard at the front of the aircraft. The separation created a clear division between high-value hostages and the general passenger population. Rachel realized this arrangement might actually provide tactical advantages if she could find a way to exploit the hijackers' focus on their priority targets. Outside, the small airfield was already receding as they gained altitude. Whatever happened next would occur at their final destination, and Rachel suspected that location would be chosen for maximum impact rather than negotiation potential. The stakes had escalated far beyond the lives of the passengers aboard Flight 847. The Boeing 737 climbed steadily through the afternoon sky, but this time the flight path was taking them directly toward the eastern seaboard. Rachel had been discreetly tracking their direction through her window, and her worst fears were being confirmed. They were heading toward Washington, D.C., following a route that would bring them over the most densely populated corridor in the United States. The Russian woman, who had identified herself to the selected passengers as Commander Volkov, was now conducting what appeared to be intelligence briefings with her high-value hostages. Federal prosecutor David Goldman was being questioned extensively about government response protocols, while Dr. Sarah Chun was being forced to provide medical assessments of passenger stress levels. Mr. Goldman, Volkov said with clinical detachment, explain to me the chain of command for hostage negotiation in federal law enforcement. Who makes the ultimate decisions about compliance with terrorist demands? Goldman's face was pale, but his voice remained steady. I'm not involved in operational law enforcement. My role is prosecution after the fact, not crisis management. Volkov smiled coldly. Your judicial experience gives you extensive knowledge of federal agency procedures. Do not insult my intelligence by claiming ignorance. She gestured to one of her armed associates. Perhaps Dr. Chun can provide medical treatment after my colleague helps refresh your memory. The threat was clear, and Goldman reluctantly began providing information about FBI hostage rescue protocols and Department of Justice decision-making procedures. Rachel realized they were systematically extracting intelligence that would help them anticipate and counter any rescue attempts. Meanwhile, the communication specialist had established contact with multiple parties. Rachel could hear fragments of conversations in Russian, Arabic, And what sounded like Farsi. The international nature of the communication suggested this operation had connections far beyond a single terrorist organization. Outside, the landscape below was becoming increasingly populated. They had crossed into Virginia airspace, and the proximity to major military installations was making Rachel's tactical assessment even more urgent. If this aircraft was intended as a weapon against a high-value target, the window for intervention was rapidly closing. The original hijacker who had first taken control was now monitoring passenger behavior with increased attention, Rachel noticed. He kept glancing at his watch and occasionally looking toward passengers who had shown any signs of composure or unusual awareness. Her own behavior was being scrutinized more carefully as well. Dr. Chun was escorted back to the main passenger area, but Rachel could see the doctor's hands were shaking. Whatever medical assessment she had been forced to conduct, it had clearly disturbed her deeply. When she caught Rachel's eye again, the doctor's expression carried a new urgency that suggested time was running out for everyone aboard. The aircraft's communication system crackled to life with an incoming transmission. Flight 847, this is Washington Control. You are entering restricted airspace. Respond immediately or you will be intercepted by military aircraft. Commander Volkov moved to the cockpit area and took control of the radio. Washington Control. This is the commander of Liberation Flight 847. We are proceeding to our designated target coordinates. Any attempt at military intervention will result in immediate detonation of explosive devices aboard this aircraft. The word explosive sent a shockwave of terror through the passenger compartment. Several people began hyperventilating, while others started praying openly. Rachel's military training kicked into overdrive as she began scanning the aircraft for signs of bombing devices she might have missed during her initial assessment. Furthermore, Volkov continued over the radio. We have placed similar devices in 3 additional aircraft currently airborne over major metropolitan areas. Any action against this flight will trigger simultaneous detonations across the eastern United States. Rachel's blood ran cold. If Volkov was telling the truth, this wasn't just a single hijacked aircraft. It was a coordinated attack involving multiple planes and potentially thousands of casualties. The scope of the operation had just expanded beyond anything she had imagined possible. The communication specialist began transmitting what appeared to be coded messages to external recipients. Rachel caught fragments that suggested activation signals for other operational units. Her worst fears were being confirmed. Flight 847 was just one component of a massive terrorist attack that was now entering its final phases. Through the cockpit door, she could hear Captain Sullivan's voice becoming increasingly strained as he was forced to navigate toward coordinates that clearly violated multiple aviation safety protocols. The stress in his voice suggested they were being directed toward airspace that no civilian aircraft should ever approach. Volkov returned to the passenger area and made another announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, in approximately 15 minutes, this aircraft will reach its final destination. Those of you in the selected group will be required to make specific communications to government authorities. Your cooperation will determine whether the passengers on the other 3 aircraft survive the next hour. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable for many passengers. Margaret Peterson, the elderly woman whose husband had experienced chest pains earlier, was now openly sobbing. The businessman David Thompson, still nursing his injured nose, was staring blankly ahead in what appeared to be shock. Rachel realized that her window for action was rapidly closing. If explosive devices were truly aboard the aircraft, any physical confrontation could trigger catastrophic results. But if they were heading toward a target in Washington, D.C., allowing the mission to continue could result in even greater loss of life. The decision was made more complex by the claim about 3 additional aircraft. Even if she could somehow neutralize the threat on Flight 847, the other operations might continue independently. Her intelligence training had covered scenarios involving coordinated attacks, and the standard protocol was to prevent as much damage as possible while gathering intelligence for broader countermeasures. Dr. Chin was called forward again. This time to examine what appeared to be a small electronic device that one of Volkov's associates had produced. Rachel couldn't see the details, but the doctor's reaction suggested it was indeed some form of explosive or detonation mechanism. The medical professional's expertise was being exploited to verify the authenticity of their threats. The aircraft began a gradual descent, and through her window, Rachel could see the distinctive landmarks of the Washington, D.C. area coming into view. The Washington Monument, the Capitol building, and other iconic structures were clearly visible below. The psychological impact of seeing their likely target was devastating for passengers, who recognized the implications. Federal Prosecutor Goldman was now being forced to make telephone calls to contacts within the Department of Justice. The conversations were being monitored by Volkov's communications specialist, and it was clear they were delivering specific demands and ultimatums to government authorities. "You will inform them," Volkov instructed Goldman, "that we require immediate withdrawal of all American military personnel from 3 specific regions in the Middle East. You will also demand the release of 47 political prisoners currently held in federal detention facilities. Finally, you will arrange for the transfer of $50 million in cryptocurrency to accounts we will specify." Rachel listened carefully to the demands, recognizing them as typically unrealistic terrorist ultimatums designed more for propaganda impact than genuine negotiation. The timing and complexity suggested this was intended as a spectacular attack rather than a genuine attempt to achieve policy changes. The communication equipment began receiving multiple incoming transmissions. Government negotiators were attempting to establish direct contact with the hijackers, but Volkov was controlling all communications with calculated precision. She was providing just enough dialogue to maintain the appearance of negotiation while continuing to advance toward their target. Outside, Rachel spotted the distinctive silhouettes of military fighter jets moving into intercept positions. The sight of F-16s flanking their civilian aircraft added another layer of urgency to an already desperate situation. If military commanders decided the threat to ground targets was too great, they might be forced to take action regardless of passenger casualties. The selected passengers were now being positioned near the communication equipment, clearly intended to serve as human shields and propaganda tools during the final phase of the operation. Dr. Chun was being forced to monitor vital signs of passengers showing signs of medical distress, ensuring that dramatic footage would be available if needed. Jennifer Walsh, the flight attendant, was brought to Rachel's section of the aircraft to check on passenger conditions. As she passed by, Jennifer whispered barely audibly, "They have something in the cargo hold." Heard them talking about timer mechanisms. The information confirmed Rachel's worst fears about explosive devices, while also providing a potential tactical insight. If the primary explosives were in the cargo compartment rather than the passenger area, it might be possible to take action without triggering immediate detonation. Volkov checked her watch again and spoke to her communication specialist in rapid Russian. The response seemed to satisfy her, and she moved back to address the passengers one final time. "Government authorities have refused our initial demands," she announced with apparent satisfaction. "This confirms their disregard for the lives of innocent civilians. In exactly 8 minutes, this aircraft will demonstrate the consequences of their intransigence." The countdown had begun. Rachel realized that regardless of the risks involved, action was no longer optional. Whether the explosive devices were real or bluff, whether other aircraft were actually involved, and whether her intervention might succeed or fail, She could not allow this plane to be used as a weapon against thousands of innocent people on the ground. She began the final mental preparations that her military training had drilled into her countless times. In 8 minutes, everything would change. 7 minutes. Rachel's hands moved with practiced precision as she quietly removed her boots under the cover of the seat in front of her. The small tactical knife secured in her right boot came free silently, a 3-inch ceramic blade designed to be undetectable by standard security screening. Her fingers closed around the familiar grip as muscle memory from countless training. Exercises took over. 6 minutes and 30 seconds. The aircraft was now at 8,000 feet and descending rapidly toward what appeared to be the National Mall. Through her window, Rachel could see the Lincoln Memorial growing larger by the second. Whatever Volkov's specific target, they were heading directly toward the heart of the American government and potentially thousands of innocent tourists and federal employees. Commander Volkov was speaking rapidly into her headset, coordinating with external parties in what sounded like final confirmation codes. Her attention was focused entirely on her communication equipment and the view ahead, creating the first tactical opportunity Rachel had identified since the hijacking began. The original hijacker, who had been monitoring the passenger section, was positioned 3 rows ahead of Rachel, his back partially turned as he watched the selected hostages near the front of the aircraft. His weapon was held casually at his side, professional positioning that kept it secure but accessible, but which also created a brief window of vulnerability. 6 minutes. Rachel began her movement, using techniques learned during urban warfare training. She slipped from her seat and into the aisle with movements so fluid they appeared natural to any casual observer. Her civilian clothes and previously maintained facade of terror provided perfect camouflage as she approached the hijacker's position. The man sensed movement behind him and began to turn, but Rachel was already inside his reaction time. Her left hand clamped over his mouth while her right drove the ceramic blade precisely into the nerve cluster at the base of his neck. He collapsed silently, his weapon falling into Rachel's waiting hands before it could clatter to the floor. 5 minutes and 45 seconds. Several passengers in nearby seats witnessed the takedown, their eyes widening in shock. Rachel immediately placed her finger to her lips, signaling for silence while displaying her newly acquired weapon. The mix of terror and hope in their faces told her they understood something had fundamentally changed about their situation. Moving with the same fluid precision, Rachel began advancing toward the front of the aircraft. The middle hijacker was positioned near row 8. His attention split between watching the cockpit area and monitoring Volkov's activities. His positioning gave Rachel a clear approach angle from his blind spot. The second takedown was even quieter than the first. Rachel's military training had included extensive close-quarters combat instruction, and the confined space of an aircraft cabin was actually advantageous for someone with her skills. The hijacker dropped without making a sound, his weapon also disappearing into Rachel's possession. 5 minutes. But the third hijacker, positioned near the rear of the aircraft, had been watching the passenger section more carefully. He spotted Rachel's movement and opened his mouth to shout a warning. Rachel's response was instantaneous. The ceramic knife left her hand with deadly accuracy, striking him in the throat before he could make a sound. Commander Volkov and her 3 associates remained focused on their final approach preparations, completely unaware that their aircraft security had been completely compromised. Rachel now controlled 3 weapons and had a clear tactical advantage, but the presence of explosive devices meant she couldn't simply open fire without risking detonation. 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Rachel reached the communication equipment, where the bearded specialist was transmitting what sounded like final coordination messages. She placed the barrel of her acquired weapon against the base of his skull and spoke quietly but with unmistakable authority. "Communications off now. The man's hands froze over his equipment as he felt the cold metal against his neck. "Who are you?" he whispered in heavily accented English. "Someone who's going to prevent you from murdering thousands of innocent people," Rachel replied. "Shut down your communications and step away from the equipment." Volkov, who had been facing forward toward the cockpit, turned at the sound of unfamiliar voices. Her face registered complete shock as she saw Rachel holding her communications specialist at gunpoint while armed with weapons that should have been in the hands of her own operatives. "Impossible," Volkov breathed. "You're just a passenger. We screened everyone." "You screened for obvious threats," Rachel said, keeping her weapon trained on the communications specialist while tracking Volkov's movements. "You didn't screen for U.S. Army intelligence." 4 minutes. The revelation hit Volkov like a physical blow. Her carefully planned operation, which had accounted for every variable she could imagine, had been compromised by someone she had completely overlooked. The ordinary-looking woman in civilian clothes had somehow neutralized 3 armed operatives without making a sound. "Your operation is over," Rachel continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command situations. "Order your pilot to divert to Andrews Air Force Base immediately, or I will assume this aircraft poses an imminent threat to national security and act accordingly." Volkov's remaining associate, positioned near the selected hostages, began reaching for his weapon. But Federal Prosecutor Goldman, understanding that the situation had shifted dramatically, grabbed the man's arm. Dr. Chun immediately joined the struggle, and within seconds, several other passengers had overwhelmed the hijacker. 3 minutes and 30 seconds. "The explosive," Volkov said with a cold smile. "You cannot stop what has already been set in motion. This aircraft will still serve its purpose whether I am in control or not." "Tell me about the timer mechanisms," Rachel demanded, pressing her weapon more firmly against the communications specialist's neck. "How much time do we have and where are they located?" The man remained silent until Rachel applied pressure to a nerve point she had learned during interrogation training. "Cargo hold," he gasped. "Twin devices with independent timers. 3 minutes remaining." Rachel's mind raced through the tactical implications. Even if she could reach the cargo hold, defusing unknown explosive devices in 3 minutes was virtually impossible without specialized equipment. But there was another option, one that required split-second timing and absolute precision. 3 minutes. "Captain Sullivan," Rachel called toward the cockpit, her voice carrying enough authority to cut through the chaos. "This is Army Intelligence Specialist Rachel Martinez. I need you to execute an emergency water landing in the Potomac River immediately." Captain Sullivan's voice came back through the cockpit door, strained but focused. "Ma'am, we're at 4,000 feet over populated areas. A water landing from this altitude and speed would be extremely dangerous. Less dangerous than allowing this aircraft to impact the National Mall with explosive devices aboard," Rachel replied. "You have less than 3 minutes to get us over water and initiate emergency landing procedures." 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Volkov was watching the exchange with growing desperation. Her meticulously planned operation was disintegrating, but she still had one card to play. "Even if you prevent this aircraft from reaching its target," she said, "the other 3 operations will continue." "You cannot save everyone. We'll see about that," Rachel said grimly. She turned to the communication equipment and began examining the transmission logs. Her intelligence training had included technical communications analysis, and within seconds she was identifying frequency patterns and encryption protocols. The aircraft banked sharply to the left as Captain Sullivan began his emergency approach toward the Potomac River. The sudden maneuver caught everyone off guard, but Rachel maintained her position and continued working with the communication system. 2 minutes and 15 seconds. "Dr. Chun," Rachel called to the medical professional, who was helping restrain the captured hijacker. I need you to check on passenger conditions and prepare for emergency water landing. Tell everyone to remove shoes, loosen belts, and brace for impact." Sean immediately began moving through the cabin, her medical training allowing her to shift seamlessly from victim to emergency responder. Other passengers who had witnessed Rachel's takedown of the hijackers were now looking to her for leadership and direction. Rachel managed to access the communication logs and began transmitting coded messages on the frequencies Volkov's team had been using. Her military communications training allowed her to send warnings about the other aircraft operations, providing federal authorities with critical intelligence that might prevent additional attacks. 2 minutes. The aircraft was now descending rapidly toward the Potomac River, but they were still over populated areas of Northern Virginia. Through the windows, passengers could see office buildings and residential neighborhoods flashing past at terrifying speed. The water was visible ahead, but it was unclear whether they would reach it before the explosive devices detonated. Jennifer Walsh, the flight attendant, was moving through the cabin with remarkable composure, helping passengers prepare for the emergency landing while coordinating with Dr. Chun on medical preparations. Her professional training was proving invaluable as the situation shifted from hijacking to survival emergency. 1 minute and 30 seconds. Rachel completed her emergency transmissions and turned her full attention back to Volkov and her communication specialist. "Give me the deactivation codes for the explosive devices," she demanded. "There are no deactivation codes," Volkov replied with bitter satisfaction. "The devices are designed to detonate regardless of external intervention. You may have stopped our primary mission, but you cannot prevent the destruction of this aircraft." 1 minute. The Potomac River was now directly ahead, and Captain Sullivan was executing the most challenging landing of his 20-year career. The aircraft was approaching the water at a steep angle and dangerous speed, but it was their only option for avoiding populated areas when the explosive devices detonated. Rachel made a final decision that would determine the fate of everyone. Aboard Flight 847, abandoning her position guarding the prisoners, she sprinted toward the rear of the aircraft where the cargo hold access panel was located. If she couldn't deactivate the devices, perhaps she could at least minimize their destructive impact. 30 seconds. The aircraft struck the water with tremendous force, throwing passengers against their restraints and filling the cabin with the sound of rushing water and screaming metal. But they were down and away from populated areas. Just as the timer on the explosive devices reached 0. The explosion erupted from the cargo hold just as the aircraft's belly hit the Potomac River. The blast tore through the rear section of the fuselage, but the water absorption significantly reduced the destructive force that would have been catastrophic over land. Instead of a weapon of mass destruction, the explosive devices became the catalyst for the most dramatic water rescue operation in Washington, D.C. history. Rachel was thrown forward by the initial impact, her body slamming against the bulkhead, separating the passenger compartment from the cargo area. The freezing river water began rushing through the ruptured hull almost immediately, and she realized they had perhaps 90 seconds before the aircraft would be completely submerged. "Emergency evacuation procedures now," she shouted over the roar of incoming water and groaning metal. Her military training kicked into crisis management mode as she assessed the survival priorities of 132 souls aboard a sinking aircraft. Dr. Sarah Chun was already moving through the tilted cabin, checking on passengers who had been injured during the violent water landing. Harold Peterson, the elderly man with the heart condition, was unconscious but breathing. His wife, Margaret, was frantically trying to wake him while water swirled around their ankles. "Dr. Chun, triage the seriously injured," Rachel called out, while making her way toward the emergency exits. "Anyone who can walk needs to help those who can't. We have maybe 2 minutes before this plane goes under." Captain Sullivan emerged from the cockpit, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, but otherwise functional. Co-pilot Mark Chun followed behind him, carrying the aircraft's emergency beacon and life raft activation equipment. Both pilots immediately began executing water evacuation protocols they had practiced countless times but never hoped to use. The aircraft was settling into the river at an angle that put the forward exits partially underwater, but the rear emergency exits remained accessible. Rachel reached the starboard rear exit and began the manual opening procedure, her hands working with precision despite the chaos surrounding her. Federal prosecutor David Goldman, despite his earlier injuries from the hijackers' assault, was helping elderly passengers toward the functioning exits. The businessman David Thompson had overcome his shock and was assisting Dr. Chun with medical triage. In the crisis, social barriers and individual fears had dissolved into collective survival instinct. Jennifer Walsh, the flight attendant, was coordinating passenger evacuation with remarkable professionalism despite having endured hours of terrorism and trauma. She had activated the emergency slides that were designed to function as life rafts in water landings, creating flotation platforms for passengers who couldn't swim. Commander Volkov and her surviving associate found themselves in the surreal position of being rescued by the same passengers they had terrorized. Rachel had to make a split-second decision about whether to prioritize their capture or focus entirely on saving lives. Military protocol demanded that she secure high-value intelligence assets, but human decency required helping everyone escape the sinking aircraft. "Volkov, you're coming with me," Rachel decided, grabbing the Russian woman by the arm while maintaining her weapon. "Your intelligence value outweighs your crimes, at least until we reach shore." The water level inside the cabin was now chest-high for shorter passengers, and the aircraft was beginning to list more severely to port. Children were being passed hand-to-hand toward the emergency exits, their cries echoing off the curved ceiling that was rapidly approaching the waterline outside. The Potomac River had exploded into activity. Coast Guard vessels were racing toward the crash site from multiple directions, their sirens and searchlights cutting through the late afternoon air. Police boats, fire department rescue units, and even civilian watercraft were converging on the area where Flight 847 was slowly disappearing beneath the surface. Rachel reached the emergency exit and kicked it open, allowing river water to rush in even faster but creating an escape route for the passengers behind her. The emergency slide had deployed properly and was floating alongside the aircraft, providing a stable platform for evacuation. "Move, move, move," she shouted, helping passengers climb through the exit onto the floating slide. The water temperature was shockingly cold, and she knew hypothermia would become a life-threatening factor within minutes for anyone fully immersed. Margaret Peterson was struggling to support her unconscious husband as they approached the exit. Rachel immediately took Harold's weight, lifting the elderly man onto her shoulders in a fireman's carry while guiding Margaret toward the slide. The couple's 60-year age difference from Rachel became irrelevant in the face of their shared humanity. Dr. Chen had identified 3 passengers with serious injuries from the crash impact. A young mother named Lisa Rodriguez had suffered what appeared to be internal bleeding, while college student Kevin Walsh had a compound fracture in his left arm. The third victim was one of the hijackers Rachel had neutralized, who was unconscious and showing signs of concussion. "Prioritize the innocent," Rachel told Dr. Chun when she hesitated over treating the injured hijacker. "We'll save him if we can, but not at the expense of passengers." The aircraft's tail section was now almost completely underwater, and the forward portion was sinking rapidly as water filled the cabin through multiple ruptures. Rachel estimated they had less than 60 seconds before the plane would be completely submerged, potentially trapping anyone still inside. Captain Sullivan was making a final sweep of the cockpit area, ensuring all emergency equipment had been retrieved and that no passengers were trapped in the forward section. His professionalism under extreme circumstances reflected the training that had enabled him to execute the emergency water landing that saved countless lives on the ground. First Coast Guard cutter reached the crash site just as the aircraft's wings disappeared beneath the surface. Rescue swimmers immediately deployed into the frigid water, their thermal suits allowing them to assist passengers who had fallen from the emergency slides or were struggling with hypothermia. Rachel found herself treading water while supporting two elderly passengers who couldn't swim. The tactical knife that had been crucial to stopping the hijacking was now useless weight, so she released it into the river depths. Her military training included extensive water survival techniques, but managing multiple rescue scenarios simultaneously was testing even her capabilities. Commander Volkov, despite being a terrorist who had planned mass murder, was also struggling to stay afloat in the freezing water. The irony wasn't lost on Rachel that she was now responsible for keeping alive the same woman who had intended to kill thousands of innocent people just minutes earlier. "Why are you helping me?" Volkov gasped as Rachel assisted her toward a Coast Guard rescue boat. "Because that's what separates us from terrorists," Rachel replied, her voice steady despite the physical and emotional exhaustion. "We save lives. You take them." The rescue operation expanded as more emergency vessels arrived. Hospital ships were standing by to receive the most seriously injured passengers, while temporary warming stations were being established on Coast Guard cutters for those suffering from hypothermia and shock. Dr. Chun had managed to stabilize Lisa Rodriguez's internal bleeding using pressure techniques and emergency medical supplies from the Coast Guard rescue swimmers. Her medical expertise, combined with the rapid response of professional emergency services, was proving to be the difference between life and death for the most critically injured passengers. Federal prosecutor David Goldman was among the first passengers pulled from the water. And despite his own injuries, he immediately began coordinating with Coast Guard commanders about the broader terrorist threat that Rachel had warned about during her emergency transmissions. "Agent Martinez," he called to Rachel as she was helping Margaret Peterson into a rescue boat. "Federal authorities need immediate debriefing about the other aircraft operations. Your intelligence could prevent additional attacks." Rachel nodded grimly while continuing her rescue efforts. The immediate crisis was nearly over, but the larger terrorist operation that Volkov had described was still unfolding. Her mission had evolved from passenger survival to national security threat assessment. The aircraft's fuselage finally disappeared completely beneath the Potomac River surface, leaving only floating debris and emergency equipment to mark where Flight 847 had made its dramatic water landing. But incredibly, early counts suggested that all passengers and crew had successfully evacuated the sinking plane. As Rachel was finally pulled into a Coast Guard rescue boat, she looked back at the crash site with mixed emotions. They had prevented a catastrophic terrorist attack on the nation's capital, saved the lives of everyone aboard the hijacked aircraft, and captured valuable intelligence assets. But the cost and trauma and the ongoing threat from additional operations meant their ordeal was far from over. Jennifer Walsh, the flight attendant whose professionalism had been crucial during both the hijacking and evacuation, was being treated for hypothermia but managed to provide Rachel with a weak smile. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved all of us." The first television news helicopters were arriving overhead, and Rachel realized that within hours, the story of Flight 847 would be international news. Her identity as the military intelligence specialist who had stopped the hijacking would inevitably be revealed, changing her life permanently. But as she watched Coast Guard medics treating Harold Peterson, who was regaining consciousness with his wife holding his hand, Rachel knew that some changes were worth making. The oath she had taken to protect innocent life had been tested under the most extreme circumstances possible, and she had not been found wanting. The real work, however, was just beginning. 3 weeks after Flight 847's dramatic water landing, Rachel Martinez sat in a secure conference room at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., reviewing classified intelligence reports that had emerged from Commander Volkov's interrogation. The information she had transmitted during those crucial final minutes aboard the hijacked aircraft had proven invaluable in preventing the other coordinated attacks. The terrorist network's plan had been even more ambitious than initially understood. 4 aircraft had indeed been targeted simultaneously, with intended impact sites including the Capitol building, the Pentagon, the New York Stock Exchange, and a major chemical processing facility in New Jersey. Rachel's early warning transmissions had enabled federal authorities to intercept the other 3 operations before they reached their final phases. Director Patricia Hayes of the FBI's Counterterrorism Division closed the briefing folder and looked across the table at Rachel. "Agent Martinez, I want you to understand the scope of what you prevented. Conservative estimates suggest your actions on Flight 847 saved between 15 and 20,000 lives, not counting the broader economic and psychological impact of multiple successful attacks." Rachel nodded quietly, still processing the magnitude of the operation she had stumbled into during what was supposed to be a routine flight home from training. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of debriefings, medical evaluations, and media attention that she was still learning to navigate. "The President has requested a personal meeting," Director Hayes continued. "There will also be formal recognition ceremonies, congressional hearings about aviation security improvements, and likely a significant promotion within Army intelligence. Your career trajectory has changed permanently." Through the conference room's reinforced windows, Rachel could see the Washington Monument in the distance, the same landmark she had watched growing larger through Flight 847's windows as they descended toward what could have been catastrophic impact. The irony of now working in the city she had helped save wasn't lost on her. Dr. Sarah Chun had returned to her medical practice in Miami, but had accepted a consulting position with the Department of Homeland Security on aviation medical emergency protocols. Her quick thinking during the evacuation had contributed significantly to the 0 fatality rate from the water landing, and her experience was now being incorporated into federal training programs. Federal prosecutor David Goldman had recovered fully from his injuries and was leading the legal team prosecuting the captured terrorists. Commander Volkov and her surviving associates faced multiple charges including terrorism, hijacking, and conspiracy to commit mass murder. Goldman's inside knowledge of their interrogation methods was proving crucial in building comprehensive cases. Captain James Sullivan and co-pilot Mark Chun had been credited with executing one of the most challenging emergency landings in aviation history. Their decision to trust Rachel's military authority during the crisis had been vindicated by subsequent investigations, and both pilots were now involved in developing new hijacking response protocols for commercial aviation. Jennifer Walsh, the flight attendant whose professionalism had been essential during both the hijacking and evacuation, had been promoted to chief flight attendant trainer for her airline. Her experience was being used to develop new crew training programs for terrorist incidents, ensuring that future flight attendants would be better prepared for similar situations. The elderly couple, Margaret and Harold Peterson, had made complete recoveries from their ordeal. Harold's heart condition had been stabilized, and the couple had insisted on sending Rachel a handwritten thank you letter every week since the incident. Their gratitude represented that of all the passengers whose lives had been saved by her split-second decision to act. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the comprehensive overhaul of aviation security that had resulted from the Flight 847 incident. Rachel's intelligence background had enabled her to identify vulnerabilities in passenger screening that the terrorists had exploited, leading to new protocols that closed critical security gaps. "There's something else," Director Hayes said, sliding another folder across the table. We've identified the source of the terrorists' intelligence about flight schedules and passenger manifests. It appears they had assistance from someone within the aviation industry who provided detailed information about Flight 847 specifically. Rachel opened the folder and began reviewing surveillance photographs and communication intercepts. The investigation had uncovered a broader network of domestic collaborators who had enabled the terrorist operation through insider information and logistical support. We believe they may have been targeting you specifically, Director Hayes continued. Your military intelligence background and the classified training you had just completed made you a high-value target for elimination or capture. The fact that they failed to identify you during their passenger screening may have been the critical factor that enabled you to stop their operation. The revelation added another layer to Rachel's understanding of the events aboard Flight 847. She hadn't simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had been specifically targeted by terrorists who understood the threat she could pose to their plans, but had failed to recognize her when it mattered most. 6 months later, Rachel stood in the Rose Garden of the White House as president. Anderson presented her with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. The ceremony was attended by many of her fellow passengers from Flight 847, creating an emotional reunion that reminded everyone present of their shared experience. Agent Martinez, the president said during his remarks, exemplifies the courage and sacrifice that define the best of American military service. Her actions aboard Flight 847 represent not just individual heroism, but the values that make our democracy strong in the face of those who would destroy it. As Rachel accepted the medal, she thought about the simple decision that had started her journey, choosing to read a thriller novel during what she expected to be a routine flight home. The irony that real-life heroism had proven far more challenging and consequential than any fictional story wasn't lost on her. The media attention eventually subsided, but Rachel's life had been permanently transformed. Her promotion to major came with assignment to a new joint task force focused on transportation security threats. Her unique experience as both an intelligence professional and terrorism survivor gave her perspectives that were invaluable in developing countermeasures against future attacks. Dr. Chun visited Rachel at her new office in Arlington, bringing updates on several of their fellow passengers. The shared trauma of Flight 847 had created bonds among the survivors that transcended their brief time together aboard the hijacked aircraft. You know, Dr. Chun said as they looked out at the Potomac River from Rachel's office window, I still think about those 8 minutes when everything could have gone differently. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been on that plane. Rachel considered the question that had haunted her own thoughts for months. Someone else would have acted, she finally replied. Maybe not with the same training or resources, but Americans don't just surrender to terrorists. Flight 847 had 132 people who refused to be victims. I just happened to have the skills to act on that refusal. Years later, when Rachel had risen to colonel and was leading her own intelligence division, she would occasionally fly commercial flights for personal travel. She always requested seat 14A when possible, partly from habit and partly as a reminder of the day when an ordinary airline seat had become the epicenter of an extraordinary act of heroism, the thriller novel she had been reading during flight. 847 remained forever bookmarked at Chapter 12. Some stories, she had learned, were meant to be interrupted by real life, and sometimes, real life proved far more compelling than any fiction ever could. Commander Volkov was ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. During her final statement at sentencing, she looked directly at Rachel, who was present as a witness, and said simply, "You were an unexpected variable in our calculations." Rachel's response was equally direct. Freedom always is. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us,